Well, here's to it.
Hello cinephiles! Welcome to Making Film, where we take an in-depth look at how cinema's greatest artists made their films. My name is Tyler, and in this episode on the screenwriting of A Clockwork Orange, we are taking a look at the themes, many of which appear throughout Kubrick's work, as well as structural similarities to his other films. In several of Kubrick's films, he used satire to communicate the themes of the story. Kubrick said, "A satirist is someone who has a very skeptical, pessimistic view of human nature, but who still has the optimism to make some sort of joke out of it, however brutal the joke might be." This is perhaps most prevalent in Dr. Strangelove, which is considered Kubrick's comedy movie. But what's interesting is that there's satire throughout A Clockwork Orange, Lolita, Full Metal Jacket, and even Barry Lyndon, but you wouldn't really consider those movies to be comedies.
You're absolutely right, sir. Back up, bleeding hole!
However, it's the satire that really draws you in and makes these stories with pretty serious subject matter accessible and amusing. It took several watches for me to realize how funny Barry Lyndon is. The civility of the characters in the movie is just so over the top. I love this scene after Barry had gotten into a very uncivilized scuffle with his stepson. He sees a friend at a restaurant and invites him over to sit at his table. The man says that he's meeting someone even though it's obvious Barry just saw the staff remove the place setting across from him. It's something you might see in a sitcom, but here, it's played totally straight and really shows how artificial our masks of civility are.
I see you're alone. Why don't you come over and join me?
Well, thank you, Barry. You're very kind, but I'm expecting someone to join me soon.
The nature of A Clockwork Orange's setting gives it even more room for absurdity. The bizarreness of the core of the plot, with the government using brainwashing to keep people from being immoral, is preposterous enough for A Clockwork Orange to be considered science fiction. No one expects that the government would literally employ such a treatment, but it points our attention at other ways we are being manipulated against possibly following immoral instincts.
I meant to have a little reverence, you bastards!
Kubrick centered his themes around technology in A Clockwork Orange, as well as his previous two films. Many consider Dr. Strangelove 2001 and A Clockwork Orange to be a trilogy of films linked by these themes revolving around technology. Dr. Strangelove shows the potential for mankind's technology to end the human race, and 2001 shows the potential for mankind's technology to replace the human race. In A Clockwork Orange, technology has the potential to change the very nature of what mankind is.
Stop it, please, I beg you!
These themes are framed by technocracy, or a society controlled by technical experts. A cynical view of authority is a theme that exists in most of Kubrick's work. This theme exists in Paths of Glory, Dr. Strangelove, A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, Full Metal Jacket, and Alison Castle notes that it even exists in Spartacus, which isn't considered a quote-unquote Kubrick project. There are politicians, the military, and in the case of A Clockwork Orange, even scientists that are attempting to force a person to conform. As pointed out in Stanley Kubrick, New Perspectives, quite often this deals with male violence, whether that be trying to force Alex to conform to being non-violent in A Clockwork Orange, to forcing Gomer Pyle to conform to becoming violent in Full Metal Jacket, to the violence in 2001 as a means for humanity to become defined in advance, to the justification of violence in Barry Lyndon as existing inside civil conformity, to even Jack conforming to the rest of the spirits in the hotel by committing acts of violence against his family in The Shining. It should be noted that this theme in A Clockwork Orange existed previously in the novel, which is likely why Kubrick became interested in the story. However, there are some new themes invented by Kubrick that didn't exist in the novel. One is the theme of, quote, intense, often physically intimate, but not explicitly sexual, relationships between men. This is brought out in scenes that Kubrick added, like Mr. Deltoid doing this,
You're from yourself!
the Minister of the Interior feeding Alex at the end, as well as the character of Julian. Aside from these themes, another thing that really makes A Clockwork Orange a Kubrick movie is its structure. Kubrick often played around with structure, but most often he favored a structure based on symmetry. Everything that happens before Alex's treatment is mirrored in what happens after Alex's treatment. His conflict with the droogs, the drunk, his parents, and Mr. Alexander are all revisited in the second half of the film. It's beautifully elegant in its simplicity. The structure is similar to Eyes Wide Shut, where there's a huge set piece in the center of the film, and the second half shows the protagonist revisiting everything from the first half. In A Clockwork Orange, Alex starts at a high point, then falls to a low point.
This is the real weepy and tragic part of the story beginning, oh my brothers and only friends.
And then back up to a high point at the end. This is inverted in Kubrick's next film, Barry Lyndon. Barry starts at a low point and climbs to a very high position before falling back down to his previous status. Even the final act of 2001 shows a regression to a simpler state, with the Baroque room and Dave becoming the star child. Similar again to A Clockwork Orange's Eyes Wide Shut, where Bill goes down a rabbit hole and winds up somewhat back to where he was on the other end. This structure lends itself to the myths, legends, and fairy tales that Kubrick was so interested in. In the book Stanley Kubrick Directs, Alexander Walker said, "Alex is that hero with 1,000 faces on whom magic is practiced by evil powers, who survives the worst, and who is ultimately restored to the realms he came from." The last third of the film, moreover, following the reformed Alex's progress through the world he once terrorized, has the same story elements of symmetry and coincidence that give to tales of magic their cyclic form and narrative satisfaction, qualities that both liberate the imagination and at the same time control the external world. Alison Castle mentions that the circular nature of A Clockwork Orange is represented visually in the bowler hat, billiard balls, eye-lined by false eyelashes, the prisoners circling around the exercise yard, and women's breasts. And there's also symmetry in the bar, in the mirror-filled bathroom of Alexander's home, and in the checkered floor tiles. And even the name Clockwork Orange has to do with the duality between the mechanical clockwork and the organic orange. Perhaps the most important theme in A Clockwork Orange is that of free will and choice. The prison chaplain is the moral center of the movie, and he delivers a line that is quite possibly the film's thesis statement.
When a man cannot choose, he ceases to be a man.
The film is about freedom of choice. And freedom of choice being we are free to live a good life, a righteous life, or to be an immoral life. I mean, but that's our choice. It's not up to the state to choose for us.
Kubrick said, "The central idea of the film has to do with the question of free will. Do we lose our humanity if we are deprived of the choice between good and evil? Do we become, as the title suggests, a Clockwork Orange?" Aaron Stern, the former head of the MPAA rating board in America, who is also a practicing psychiatrist, has suggested that Alex represents the unconscious, man in his natural state. After he's given the Ludovico cure, he has been civilized, and the sickness that follows may be viewed as the neurosis imposed by society. The question is society the only reason we don't behave like Alex? Is there an unconscious level in which we would want to behave like Alex? Is selfishness instinctual? And is it our burden to overcome it?
Have you not everything you need? If you need a motor car, you pluck it from the trees. If you need pretty Polly, you take it.
I've always been disturbed by the idea of how potentially different my morality would be if I was born into something like Nazi Germany. It's strange to think that someone you know would be a despicable person, if not for a society that convinces that person that they don't want to. If Alex was living in a society in which the things he did were not considered to be bad, would he still be an immoral person? There was a philosopher named Rousseau who put forth an idea that people are born innocent and it is society that corrupts them. After all, even high art and culture like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony works against the idea of peace in the film. The music helps to trigger violent tendencies in Alex. Kubrick responded to this saying, "I don't think that man is what he is because of an imperfectly structured society, but rather that society is imperfectly structured because of the nature of man. No philosophy based on an incorrect view of the nature of man is likely to produce social good." Burgess was brought up Catholic with the idea of original sin. He said that Alex is a man in that he is inherently violent. He sees beauty in the world, in this case music, and has an affinity for language.
Some great bird had flown into the milk bar, and I felt all the melanky little hairs on my plot standing endwise.
But if you produce a human being without the will to do evil, then you produce a human without the will to do anything. In an interview, Burgess said, "The film and the book are about the danger of reclaiming sinners through sapping their capacity to choose between good and evil. Most of all, I wanted to show in my story that God made man free to choose either good or evil, and that this is an astounding gift." In the same interview, Kubrick gave his thoughts on the matter. He said, "The fact that Alex is evil personified is important to clarify the moral point that the film is making about human freedom. The question is whether or not the Ludovico treatment really makes a man good. The essential moral question is whether or not a man can be good without having the option to be evil, or whether such a creature is still human. To restrain man is not to redeem him." Kubrick had said that he doesn't choose stories based on politics or the issues of the day, and that it just so happens that A Clockwork Orange was particularly topical when it came out. I guess it still is. Dr. Strangelove and 2001 were even more topical when they came out. In an interview with Gene Siskel, Kubrick said that the themes of behavioral psychology and the conditioning of antisocial behavior were only partially what interested him in the story, but that his main focus was on the novel as a work of art. That said, he mentions in the interview how these themes relate to B.F. Skinner's 1971 book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Skinner was a psychologist, and the book, according to Wikipedia, quote, argues that the entrenched belief in free will and the moral autonomy of the individual, which Skinner referred to as dignity, hinders the prospect of using scientific methods to modify behavior for the purpose of building a happier and better organized society. He thought that the limits of personal freedom keep a person from truly having free will. Kubrick said, "Certainly one thing which relates to the story is the question of how authority can cope with the problems of law and order without becoming too oppressive, and, more particularly, in relation to the ever-increasing view that politics are irrelevant to the solution of social problems, that there's no time for political and legal solutions, that social issues have to be solved immediately even if this means going outside law and politics. What solutions authority may evolve certainly concerns me, and is one of the great unanswered social problems." Kubrick notes that the political right and left are depicted in A Clockwork Orange, the minister being, quote, a figure of the right, and Mr. Alexander as, quote, a lunatic of the left.
The government's big boast, as you know, sir, is the way they have dealt with crime during the last few months, recruiting brutal young roughs into the police, proposing debilitating and will-sapping techniques of conditioning.
This is a pretty good depiction of Kubrick's cynicism toward politics. In that interview, Kubrick agreed with Siskel that society seems to be impatient when making attempts at solving problems. He said that this mood is likely due to the extreme political promises that politicians often make in order to get elected, as well as, quote, the intense over-communication of ideas which contributes to this feeling that if a problem can't be solved in a very short time, one shouldn't attempt political or legal solutions, but more radical or antisocial or extra-legal solutions. We see this even today in a wide variety of quote-unquote solutions to problems. However, I can't think of a better representation of this idea than the Ludovico treatment. How convenient it would be to make it impossible for criminals to commit more crimes. Kubrick elaborates, saying, I think the danger is not that authority will collapse, but that finally, in order to preserve itself, it, established authority, will become very repressive. Law and order is not a phony issue, not just an excuse for the right to go further right. In a separate interview, Kubrick goes on to say, certainly one of the most challenging and difficult social problems we face today is, how can the state maintain the necessary degree of control over society without becoming repressive? And how can it achieve this in the face of an increasingly impatient electorate who are beginning to regard legal and political solutions as too slow? A Clockwork Orange is seen as a pessimistic film, and perhaps no part is more pessimistic than the ending. Alex is both offered a job in the government and cured of his treatment. Kubrick said, Alex's last line,
I was cured, all right.
might be seen in the same light as Dr. Strangelove's exit line.
Monsieur has been walked!
The final images of Alex as the spoon-fed child of a corrupt, totalitarian society, in Strangelove's rebirth after his miraculous recovery from a crippling disease, seem to work well both dramatically and as expressions of an idea. However, there have been optimistic interpretations of the ending. The book Stanley Kubrick New Perspectives notes that the final image seems to depict Alex having consensual sex, and in the previous scene, while being shown slides and asked to fill in the word bubbles, Alex reverts to his hoodlum ways until there's a picture depicting a naked woman, where Alex instead makes a joke.
What do you want?
No time for the old in and out, love. I've just come to read the meter.
In the book, Alex narrates in the equivalent scene as, quote, they were like pictures of real horror show debauchkas, and I said I would like to give them the old in-out with lots of ultra-violence. McDowell improvised all of his lines in this scene, so it is possible that this theory of Alex being cured as a separation of sex and violence was not intended or even considered by Kubrick. That said, New Perspectives also notes that Kubrick changed the William Tell scene from the rape of underage girls to consensual sex among adults, which could be a setup to the separation of sex and violence at the end of the film. The final line in the American version of the book has Alex listen to the Ninth Symphony and imagine, quote, carving the whole listo of the creaking world with my cutthroat Britva, finally reading, I was cured all right. Kubrick could have just as easily had the final image as something much more nefarious. I'll leave you with a quote from Malcolm McDowell on his interpretation of the ending. He said, Alex is free at the end. That's hopeful. Maybe in his freedom, he'll be able to find someone who can help him without brainwashing. If his Ludwig van can speak to him, perhaps others can. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned because the final video about the screenwriting of A Clockwork Orange will ask the question, are we supposed to identify with Alex? I just want to quickly mention that a friend of the channel has a new book coming out on Kubrick's The Shining. His name is Robert Vatcher, and the book is I Am Jack's Axe, Breaking Down the Barriers of Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining. Keep an eye out for it. It should be out before the end of the year. A Clockwork Orange was suggested by my patrons over on Patreon. If you like this stuff, please send $1 my way on Patreon and help me get around demonetization issues. And you'll get to watch the new episodes before everyone else. Click the link here. Until next time, I'm Tyler. Thanks for watching.